What's the harm? Reducing the stigma around cannabis means educating people about the plant and its effects. While many regulators are focused on harm reduction, with cannabis there really isn't much harm to reduce, compared to alcohol, opioids, and other substances. Over in Canada, Professor Daniel Bear from Humber College is behind a PSA initiative to promote knowledge and normalise safe consumption. We call this Mindful Consumption and Benefit Maximization, or MCBM. We find out more. Hello and welcome to the Lobsterpot podcast. I'm Dave Barton, your host for today, and we have a guest here from the great nation of Canada, Dr. Daniel Bear. Brilliant name, by the way, I have to say, from Humber College in Toronto. Good to meet you, sir. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, not at all. Not at all. I mean, I've been reading a lot of the things that you've put together of late, particularly around harm reduction, which is, again, here in the UK, particularly poignant thing that a lot of people are talking about vis-a-vis sort of medical cannabis. But I think your approach as well, and is quite an interesting one, because you've recently put together a paper on something called, was it MCBM? So we're talking about, was it mindful consumption and benefit maximization,
That's
which
right.
again is similar in some ways. But tell us a little bit more about yourself, and I'm kind of get into that a little bit, because you've actually lived and worked in the UK before, and you did a study over here, didn't you, around cannabis? So tell us a little bit about your background.
Yeah, for sure. So I grew up in California originally and came to the UK to do a master's degree at the London School of Economics. And what was supposed to be 1 year in London turned into 5 because I had access to the Metropolitan Police Service and was doing work with their community safety team, their community neighborhood officer teams, um, and then ended up doing work with response teams for a year and did my PhD work looking at how police officers in London implement cannabis laws and how drugs in general fit into their day-to-day policing activities. And actually, I spent a year with the Met, and my last shift with the Met was the day before the 2011 riots. And actually, my last shift, I remember we started the shift with a parade, a briefing with all the officers, and they said, an officer's been shot in London, but don't worry, we got the guy who did it. And that was Mark Duggan, and that led to 3 days of very intense civil unrest, the likes of which we haven't even seen. Even with the recent stuff with the attacks on the immigrant housing, it was quite intense. And everybody said, "Oh, aren't you glad that you missed that by a day? You didn't have to be in the field with the police during that." I said, "Are you kidding me? That's like the pinnacle of research to have been there." And
Oh no.
um, but
Yeah,
we
no.
we saw the lead up to that with the
Mm.
policing practices that were quite discriminatory and disproportionate in nature. They weren't finding a lot. They had about a 7% success rate when they stopped some people to look for cannabis, and so it was a pretty interesting period and a unique experience to be able to ride along with the Met for a year and see all that take place.
I'll say. I mean, again, what do you feel like? Do you feel like? I mean, we're talking about over 10 years ago, but do you feel like there were kind of positive or kind of very negative attitudes within the Met towards cannabis, or was it a case of that we have more important things to be dealing with? Because that's I guess for a lot of boroughs. I mean, I've spoken to people in the past, speaking to um, a, a couple of sort of Labour MPs, and they were sort of telling me, again, in sort of inner city boroughs where they were represented, it was very much a case of, we're looking to kind of almost decriminalize, because it's just not one of the things that is important in terms of, there are more violent crimes to attend to. I mean, do you feel like there's a kind of, well, tell us what your kind of
Yeah.
observations are, because
So
I
I
think
think
it's an
I
interesting one.
think yeah, if you look at community surveys, for example, they
Mm.
list cannabis enforcement as basically the lowest priority.
Mhm.
And theoretically, the Met's priority should have been going after much
Mhm.
higher rated issues for people. The
Mhm.
officers inside the Met, I wrote a paper on this and I called it the need to create a narrative. And a lot of officers were in favor of legalization. They
Mhm.
felt that it was a waste of their time to go after cannabis. At the time, cannabis had recently been reduced from an arrestable offense to just the cannabis warning system that's in place. And
Mhm.
that led to a huge increase in cannabis sanctions. And the reason for that was that it was so quick and easy to do a cannabis warning. It took about 10 minutes. And officers didn't feel bad because they were like, well, we're not arresting anybody. I'm not harming anybody. I
Mhm.
get the win that I need. I get what's known as a sanction detection in policing. So I can show my sergeant, my inspector that I'm performing, I'm doing
Mhm.
these things. And because they had targets they had to hit, they had to get a sanction detection somehow. Cannabis was super easy. And for a lot of officers, cannabis was the thing that let them go on to do real policing, because once they had that sanction detection out of the way, they could go and police and patrol the areas and engage in the kind of non-enforcement or discretionary enforcement in other situations where they didn't feel the pressure to get that sanction detection. So they could, counsel a young kid who had, shoplifted, and instead of being like, well, I really need the arrest, I really
Hmm.
got to, show something for this, they could just be like, oi, don't do this again.
Hmm.
And so cannabis was a way of creating freedom for them. It was also a tangible win.
Hmm.
And policing seems like an exciting profession, but most of my time with police was spent driving around in circles in the dark in London. And that call for action, that call for something comes, and it's exciting and it's challenging. And I was sitting in the backseat. I didn't have to do anything, and it was still exciting and challenging. But so many times it ended up with no, you couldn't find the burglar. You couldn't. You're going to a domestic situation where, okay, you've told one person to leave, but that was sort of the extent of it. Cannabis was a tangible win. You walked
Hmm.
in to the station and you had this bag in your hand, and even though it was a little bit of like, it looked like dried up grass that you would have been appalled with if you'd seen that on your lawn. It was, look what I got. I got a win, and
Hmm.
sometimes you needed that win just to maintain a bit of professional identity.
Right.
That being said, there were some officers that thought cannabis was the worst thing in the world. Um, One of them said that, skunk rots your brain quicker than you can say Rastafarian. That was a great line from my work that I'll always remember.
Okay.
But it was a really mixed bag. But a lot of them were using cannabis to get to an outcome that they needed or wanted.
Hmm. I mean, I guess now that we've got medical here, I would imagine. I mean, I don't. You probably don't know, but I would imagine at the same time that. I mean, what I hear from people is that there still needs to be very much this education piece amongst the Met Office in, not just the Met, but just kind of the police generally. Across. There was a campaign recently from South Wales Police that was a kind of a pamphlet, was just kind of like cannabis is illegal. If you do this, if you do that, and it's not kind of like, well, actually, if you're a patient, then perhaps you should, inform the police officer in question and demonstrate, your prescription or something. It still very much feels like you're in the wrong and you need to prove that you're right. And I don't necessarily think that I think people still have that perception, I suppose. But when it comes to sort of healthcare and medication and patients, that there's more outcry. Actually, this being treated as a criminal first, I think that's the perception is wrong. And again, when we talk about things like harm reduction, I guess from a policing standpoint, thinking of the term harm reduction is still very much like, well, if we take it out of the legacy market, then the proceeds, even if the cannabis itself is not the thing that's problematic, it's like the financing the proceeds of other crime potentially. So again, therein lies the argument to legalize it in some ways. But again, in Canada, when you sort of return again, when sort of legalization started to happen, what do you feel like attitudes were on the ground? Do you think a lot of people for rec legalization, because that happened around, I think that's 2018, so it was the same
That's right,
time
October
as
2018. Yeah.
that's around the same time that medical became legal here. Do you feel like people were more ready for it because they'd had the medical market in Canada beforehand?
Yeah, I mean, I think with police, I'll address the policing side of it. With
Mm.
police, they certainly, if we look at their arrest numbers and their interaction numbers in the years preceding legalization, we can very clearly see a drop off that accelerated when the Liberal government in 2015 was elected with their platform saying, we
Hmm.
will legalize cannabis. And the numbers that had already been dropping in the years before then just fell off a cliff. We
Hmm.
went from about 55,000 interactions around cannabis a year to down to about 15,000. And it stayed that way since legalization. From
Hmm.
a public perception, Canada had about 17 years of medical cannabis access before then. And excuse me, um, that I think primed a lot of people. There
Hmm.
was a market set up. There were distribution channels. We had about 250,000 people consuming legally prescribed medical cannabis. But also, we've just had wider access to cannabis here in Canada for a long time. BC Bud has been, since the 70s, well known around the world. And just higher percentage of people consume cannabis in Canada. We're the, I think, number two highest country in the OECD. Where right now, under legal cannabis, we have about 27% of people reporting annual cannabis consumption. The vast majority of those, about 67 to 68%, say that they're consuming 3 times a month or less frequent. So
Mhm.
we have a lot of people who have low level familiarity,
Yeah.
infrequent consumption of cannabis. And so that did, I think, make it a bit easier. For police, they still needed to be brought in, even though their numbers had dropped, and that represents frontline officers,
Mhm.
less inclination to go for cannabis. The policing bureaucracy itself still needed a bit of a shove and to be guided into the pathways. And frankly, they help shape the market a bit so that we have a relatively strict but broad commercial market.
Mhm. No, absolutely. And I think in terms of the way in which, I guess, well, like you rightly say, you're talking around, there's a lot more sort of familiarity. I feel like culturally, North America is a lot more of a familiar with cannabis, or it's more embedded in North American culture more broadly than it is
Mhm.
perhaps here in the UK or in other European countries. But again, it's interesting that, the sort of work you've been doing around, the sort of, you know, sort of benefit maximization and mindful consumption and things like that, that is, I feel like it sort of ticks the box of harm reduction, which again I think is a lot of the argument. If we are going to regulate a cannabis market, we need to have these sort of things in place. But again, it still very much feels like, we're starting with the negatives and sort of saying you must not do this, you must not do that. Whereas I think this approach is, it's the same thing, but it's kind of couched more in positive language, and it invites people to explore things for themselves in a more, meaningful way, and make it more personalized to them. Do you feel like that? What was the kind of, I guess, rationale behind that being the sort of public service campaign that you were working with? And if you could tell us a little bit about that campaign as well.
Yeah. So we've done a lot of work around public education around cannabis,
Hmm.
because I know that when I started consuming cannabis at 16, I was consuming for medical purposes. There was nothing out there for me, and I was 16, and I was relying on cannabis to help me. I was dealing with PTSD and some very serious injuries and traumatic brain injury after being assaulted, and I just had nothing. And so I used cannabis in ways that were probably not super beneficial. Some ways were, like, it was helping me and dealing with flashbacks, but I was using it a bit too much. I was looking for high strength THC, which for a young person is not the thing that we want to promote. And now that I'm in a professional capacity where I work around cannabis policy, over the last 5 years, I've said, you know what, the policy question is one thing, but we really need to make sure our education is good. Because even after legalization, I was seeing a lot of stuff here that relied on that old approach, and it was, when the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and people were still talking about cannabis in the ways and the language of prohibition. And I said, we need to do better. So we worked with cannabis consumers and bud tenders to build a campaign called Weed Out Misinformation. And one of the key things we heard from the 1,500 cannabis consumers we surveyed in Canada was that they wanted accessible education. They wanted things that were tailored to their needs. And when we ran focus groups with the young people, they all said some version of, this is why I'm using cannabis, and this is how I'm shaping my use to fit my needs. But they weren't getting the information they needed. They were trial and error. And so they needed, excuse me, sorry, some guidance, some support and how to do that. And none of the materials were there. And so I was thinking, how do we take the harm reduction message of start low, go slow, look for more balanced THC products, don't smoke and drive? How do you take that message, but actually say it in a way that connects with people? Because every example that we were showing people in the focus groups of other cannabis education campaigns, they're saying, no, this feels stigmatizing. This feels like it doesn't really address my needs. And what we came up with was the idea of mindful consumption, benefit maximization. And the idea there is pretty straightforward. Harm reduction starts with the idea that there is a harm and you need to reduce the harm. And by starting with the harm, you turn people off. They hear the echoes of prohibition in whatever you're saying, even if you're not there and you're not intending it. I've been involved with cannabis for over 20 years. I've been a cannabis consumer for over 20 years. And even the materials that I thought sounded okay to me were registering stigmatizing to other people. And so
Yeah.
we said, okay, we really got to start with, what do people need? And that's the way we engage them, by asking them, what do you need? What is the mindful consumption? How are you consuming cannabis? What are you looking to get out of this experience? If we start that conversation with people, they understand we're not trying to attack them. They understand that we're not trying to get in the way of the thing that they're searching for. And in fact, we're trying to aid them. And that's where the benefit maximization comes in. How can we get you this thing with the most benefit for what you're consuming? And implied in that is reducing the negatives. We don't focus on the negatives. We focus on the benefits that people want. And as part of that, discuss the negatives that can come with it. I've had people say, well, you're just encouraging people to consume cannabis with an MCBM approach. And that's not at all true. What we're doing instead is saying, if you're going to make the decision to consume cannabis, you need to have all the information available to you in a way that works for you and with information tailored to your specific needs. I remember we had one young person in our focus group, and she was saying how she was using cannabis for a bit of anxiety around schoolwork. So she wanted something that was a quick onset. She didn't want edibles. But, she was 23, but she was living at home and she couldn't smoke a joint. She didn't want anything that smelled. And, even with the bathroom fan on, she didn't want, didn't want to risk her parents smelling. And no one had talked to her about how vapes can support, get her something that's quick onset, that's
Hmm.
titratable so she can find the right dose for her. But also the differences in vapes. If you go with a vape cartridge, what we use here, either a PAX cartridge or what we call a 510 thread thing that screws into the battery.
Hmm.
Um, there are different versions. And if you go with a full spectrum rosin, um, you are going to have a bit of smell because of all the terpenes and the cannabinoids that are pulled straight off the plant matter. Whereas if you want something with no smell, you should go with a distillate, which just pulls the THC and the CBD off, and that might work for you better. And it's that tailored level of education, that treating someone as an adult who's making a decision about their drugs use and wants to get a certain effect out of it. We can have that conversation, and by treating people with respect and acknowledging their desire to use cannabis to meet certain goals, get them to actually adhere to lower risk cannabis practices that in the long run provide a public health benefit, provide an individual health benefit, and avoid some of the potential harms of cannabis, which are quite a bit less than alcohol, but are still present.
No, absolutely. But I think again, yeah, you've hit the nail on the head where you talked about, actually people need to be given information. Who else is giving them that information, and whose kind of place is it? I mean, in terms of, do you see it as, obviously there's a public health kind of, I guess, need to do that, but at the same time, and this is why I always think about here in the UK, and I know there are kind of restrictions around, how you can advertise or can't advertise. But again, there's still a lot of kind of online content, there's a lot of campaigns and things like that. But again, what can we almost, well, I suppose in Canada, a lot of the products that you were talking about there were all completely legal, right? They're all
Yeah.
accessible, they're all usable. But I suppose that there's no difference in kind of transposing that to, how do we sort of look at that from a medical market perspective? How can we
Well,
encourage?
legalization
Yeah.
legalization has changed quite a bit because you can have conversations after legalization that
Mm,
seem verboten before legalization because people, once it's legal, politicians, public health folks, they don't have to worry about well, this is a illegal product and like, how are
mhm,
we couching our language? They're still cautious, but the government of Canada has come a long way. The materials are much, much better now. They definitely take on at least a whiff of harm reduction at the very least, and sometimes quite a
mm,
bit better. I've spoken with folks at Health Canada, our Ministry of Health, and our public health services, and they're doing a lot better. The UK is no stranger to harm reduction. I mean, the British system for heroin maintenance treatment started in the 1920s and continued all the way through the 50s. The UK understands harm reduction. The public health service is there, but they've gotten so used to this idea of stigma and prohibition that it's really going to take quite a bit to get them out of their torpor. Like they need to be uh, pushed to the fore now. And I know when I was living in the UK, there were some drinking campaigns because that's the big issue
mhm.
in the UK. I mean,
Yeah.
let's be frank. When I was with the police for a year, I went to no cannabis related violence calls, but I went to a ton of fights at the pub, fights outside the pub, fights at a party, fights just in a house, like all of them
Mhm.
alcohol related. And, I can see how that tempers the willingness to engage in open discussions of how people might consume drugs a bit more openly when the experiences of the last sort of 80 years have been alcohol fueled violence.
Mhm.
And that people have forgotten how the UK was a leader in providing heroin treatment, like providing actual heroin to people who were dependent on heroin in a way through their GPs, so that they could maintain um, an active life and be part of their community and get just enough heroin to keep them from going into withdrawal. And we can go back to that level of engagement of we believe in harm reduction, we believe in treating people. It's just it's going to take a lot.
But that's it. I mean, again, like you were saying, when it comes to sort of cannabis itself, I mean, yeah, there are harms associated, but again, there isn't. They are greatly reduced compared to things like opiates and heroin and to alcohol as well. And again, it just feels like, is there what I would really like to see here is kind of like the clinics, the kind of pharmacies, the brands and things like that that are active here, kind of doing something around that, talking about benefit maximization and mindful consumption and sort of and again, maybe they are, but it's not kind of prevalent, and it's not seeming, what they are doing isn't seeming to have an impact on kind of growing the patient numbers we have here. It's still very much in the dark, or there's still kind of, I mean, I think a lot of people just don't know still, and those that do know and going through the process of getting a prescription here, it's still, that's still sort of prohibitive in terms of, you need to, try at least 2 different treatments for a qualifying condition and things like that. And, again, then there's the stigma of like, you have to link your medical records, and people are like, well, I don't want my GP knowing I have cannabis, even though, it's medical
Yeah.
cannabis, So you still have a lot of those, I guess, deeply entrenched kind of biases, even amongst people who actively want it. But it still comes to me and makes me think, well, what has kind of worked in terms of like raising people's awareness and going, well, actually maybe I will try it because I can see the benefit here, and again, I guess.
Yeah, legalization has been a
Yeah.
dramatic shift. We've seen some of our fastest rising numbers of cannabis consumers have been over 45, and particularly around the old age pensioners. We're seeing them increase their cannabis use. I was sitting in a cafe 2 years ago in the summer doing some work. Sorry, I'm on a British show, I should say, a calf, and
We know what you mean.
and
Yeah, it's all good.
yeah. So I didn't want to sound too French. And there was a table of older women behind me. I had to be in their 70s and 80s, and they were all discussing, oh, my grandson gave me this cream, or oh, I'm trying this vape and I'm doing this thing. And it really has been the doors have blown open. We've seen the number of people who are on the registered medical cannabis patient list drop from about 250,000 to about 120,000 since legalization. And when you ask people who are going into the non-medical stores, to the recreational stores, why are you using cannabis? Close to 70% of them list a reason that falls under a medical or mental health reason of some kind. So what we're seeing is that people are coming out and saying, yeah, I'm going to give this a try. I'm going to engage this. My own father, great story here. They're in California, so slightly different system, but still
Mhm.
legal,
Yeah.
both medical and recreational. And growing up, he was, Mr. I'm going to take you to the cops myself if I find you with weed. Very much on
Mhm.
that pathway. And now I go visit him, and he's, he's got different tins of gummies, and oh, this is the one your mother likes when her knee is really sore, and this is the one I use before bed, and this is the one that if my back is bad, like. And I'm just going, who the hell are you people?
That's it. That's it. Who are you, and what have you done with my parents? Yeah.
Yeah, and it's amazing how once you
Yeah.
have legalization and the stigma has dropped a bit, and people say, you know what, I might try this, I might give it a go. And some people find that they don't react well to it or doesn't work for them. And cannabis and CBD is not a cure-all. It is not a wonder drug capable of solving everything. But we know that CBD has very good anti-inflammatory properties. We know cannabis can work quite well for people. Part of the thing that needs to be updated when you do legalize cannabis is you need to change the way you collect data around cannabis. Because right now, I would be considered a daily cannabis consumer because I take some CBD and CBG each morning.
Mhm.
No THC is part of that, but uh, I'd be considered a daily cannabis consumer. And you actually need a lot more nuance once you have legalization because people are taking all sorts of products. They're looking for different cannabinoids And as a century of prohibition comes to an end and different cannabinoids potential is being identified and then stripped from the THC and tested individually, tested as part of entourage effects, we're starting to see people say, well, okay, well, I'm looking for CBC, CBG. God, I can't even keep up with all the different cannabinoid names. I'm really bad with them.
But I know, but I totally get it. It's people, as the kind of market opens up and more the scientific research and there's more kind of products and form factors and things like that, people are becoming, they do have the luxury of saying, well, I don't want to smoke it, I don't want to vape it, I don't want the smell, I don't want this. I'd rather just have a gummy, I'd rather just have a tincture, I'd rather that they have the luxury or the option to be able to do those sorts of things.
Oh,
But
yeah.
that's because it's come out of the closet and it's become legal, kind of recreationally. And that kind of seems to be the impetus. Whereas I guess the situation we have here in Britain right now is that we know that there's something like 1.8 million people are self-medicating through the illicit market. What do we have? Like 40,000 registered patients. So what's to stop those 1.8 million coming onto the medical market? Well, probably some of the factors I've outlined already, but mostly because, well, if you've been, your plug down the road has been reliably providing you with product for the last however many years, and it works for you, whatever, the condition, recreational, medical, whatever, why would you go through the hassle of going into the legal market other than to just be legal? And I suppose that almost seems to contrast with what you're saying. It had to become legal in order for people to start thinking that, oh, actually, I can use this to help me for various conditions. And I think that's
Exactly. And one of the things to consider
interesting.
too, as you mentioned, people and their dealer, many people have longstanding relationships with their cannabis dealer. One of the things we do need to consider under any legalization pathway is how those dealers are being incorporated, because we do have a small percentage of people now, and it's decreasing over time, who just say, listen, I'm not going to a retail market. I'm sticking with my dealer. I'm not going to the legal market. For a while, initially prices were a bit higher and they had that justification and there weren't enough stores, but prices have come down. They're basically on par with the illicit market. We've got more than plenty number of stores now. But you need to ensure that there's an equitable system created to bring people from the illicit market, both consumers and dealers, into the legal market, or else you're going to have a really tough competition against the illicit market. And if you suddenly do manage to pull a lot of people away and you don't have any sort of jobs programs, training programs, opportunities in the legal market for people who've made their livelihood selling cannabis, and there's a lot of people out there who are doing that. It's not just some teenage kid, on the street corner at a council flat. Like, that's the image that, I know TV and police want to put forward, but that's really not the real image there. There needs to be an equitable and just system to bring people into that market. If you acknowledge that the product is now legal, and the implication is that it probably shouldn't have been illegal for as long as it was, then you also need to do things to ensure a fair economic outcome that supports the well-being of people. Because whether you like those people or not, like, you can think that they're scum of the earth for violating the laws for however long they have been. You can not like them at all. But from a larger community economic standpoint, it is to your benefit to ensure that they're not suddenly out of work and unemployed and can't put anything on their CV for the last 20 years. You want them to be able to move into the legal market, paying taxes, being part of that, and bringing their knowledge and expertise of
Well, that's
cannabis
it. That's
into
the
the
whole
legal
thing.
market.
And this is about, when in the US, when different states open up and they start to, forgive certain crimes and things like that, it just makes economic sense, because the people who are doing time for, growing and dealing, they're the ones who have the product knowledge, who can actually grow good stuff. So in the incentives there. But again, I think, more and more, sort of a lot of the legacy brands we have here, they are, trying to get into the medical market, which seems crazy that, people who are essentially, in the eyes of the law, career criminals, now wanting to become, dispensing medical cannabis, which again is just one of the reasons I love this industry, because it's so strange and topsy-turvy and done of things that, could happen, absolutely will happen. But I think, again, to your point around, what attitudes towards, legalization and what happens kind of after, again, I think that, again, it's almost like we're looking across the pond at, the US and Canada and thinking, well, what have they done right? What haven't they done wrong? And I think when it comes to trying to figure out, our own journey here in the UK around, how do we get to, how do we increase patient numbers? How do we destigmatize it? How do we kind of get a rec market? I think, again, there's no easy answer, but I think when you start to think around the idea of normalization and to kind of have it embedded in culture in different ways, and to think, to sort of almost change that perception, like with your campaign around, can never say it properly, MCBM.
MCBM, yeah.
I was MC again, CBD, CBG, MC. Anyway,
Too many acronyms flying around. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all good. But no, when it comes to things like that, again, it's having those perceptions, publicly visible for people to go, well, actually, maybe it isn't so bad. Maybe it is helping people. And again, it's, what's your kind of experience? I mean, what are your kind of thoughts? I mean, knowing what we're like here in Britain. What's your kind of thoughts on how we could maybe get towards a sort of greater acceptance? And
that's a tough one.
No, I appreciate that.
The pub culture is so ingrained because there's a social element to it, right? The alcohol is a component, but pubs provide a social atmosphere unlike I've found really anywhere else in the world. At the London School of Economics, there were 3 pubs on campus. One for undergrads, one for postgrads, and one for faculty and staff. And going out and having a pint with folks at the end of a day was really lovely. It was great, on a nice day, standing out on the sidewalk, and on a cold day, you're inside huddled around a table with a packet of crisps that have been opened up properly so it lays flat, and everybody's having a couple. And there really is something quite special about that. And cannabis, because of its often smoked nature and its prohibition, it can provide some of that, but it's very hard, I think, when you have that ingrained socialization via alcohol. So under legalization or in a lead up to legalization, anything that Britain would do to find ways of creating alternative social pathways, social connections that can involve cannabis or not, so that people don't lose that social aspect of their lives. There would be a tremendous public health benefit if Britons started consuming more cannabis and less alcohol. I remember when I was living in the UK, the stat that I love to tell people was that on any given weekday, there were more pints of beer poured than there were people in the UK. That tells you there's quite a significant consumption of alcohol.
I can believe it. Yeah.
And, so legalization has to provide opportunities. People will still drink beer, right? We've seen only about a 3 or 4% decrease in alcohol consumption since legalization here, but that's a significant amount. I know personally, like, I'm consuming less alcohol than before legalization because there are products that can meet my need. Instead of having a couple glasses of wine on a Friday night with my wife, I might have a 2 milligram gummy and then 1 glass of wine. So instead of 3 glasses, I have 1 glass and a gummy. That works out quite nicely. And so anything that Britain can do to reduce stigma, but also find ways of creating social connection. And some of that can be through the way cannabis policies are written, so that you allow for vaping indoors. It's probably unlikely to find and allow smoking indoors at this point of anything, although cannabis smoke is quite different than others. But if you can create smoking lounges, or you could create allowing for vaping in certain places, things like that, so people could still congregate in the infrastructure, the pubs that are there and ready to go and provide great community and social meetup spots. That might be one thing to consider. The other thing that I would say is that you need to have a new education campaign ahead of legalization, at the start of legalization, and in the years following. There has to be information, because people lack that information about safe consumption practices if it's not been something that they've been either directly exposed to or educated about in the past. There is a long history of alcohol consumption in the UK, especially in its sort of modern form. So people have learned the rules and the ways to stay safe, although not everyone. And they need to have that education once legalization is on the table, because if not, you're going to have people who have some bad experiences with cannabis or consuming too much. You're going to have people who think, oh, I'm going to eat this edible and it hasn't hit yet in 10 minutes, so I'm going to eat 3 more. And then all of a sudden they're going to be in a bad spot. It's a pretty rookie mistake, but it still happens here in Canada. We still saw emergency room visits increase. And and you need to educate doctors about and pharmacists about interactions around cannabis, things like that. So there's a lot that needs to go into it. I think reducing stigma and providing open education and dialogue is something that's really important, but not losing the cultural elements that keep people happy and healthy, which a pub provides. You know, the alcohol sort of takes away from that, but socialization is a really important and good thing.
No, absolutely. And again, I know that there are kind of like patient or medical lounges sort of opening up more and more here in the UK. And there's there's a kind of group for them now, sort of a society, and they're all kind of coming together. But again, like I was still telling you off camera, I went to Product Earth at the weekend, which is kind of, one of the biggest kind of consumer focused plant medicine shows in the UK, but predominantly cannabis. But again, I think there's significant community and people are looking for safe spaces to consume. So, again, it comes down to that. Well, I don't want to be alone, but I suppose a lot of people feel like, if they're, this is medicine and I have to take it, then, why? But it's hard to kind of change that perception of what medicine is or how it can be used in a way, which,
Yeah.
again,
We used
so I
to,
think, yeah.
I was
Sorry.
gonna say we used to have a lot of what were called compassion clubs or cannabis buyers clubs, places like
Mhm.
that,
Yeah.
because people who were coming into the medical market, they were alone, they were scared, they were often
Mhm.
very sick, right? I worked with a group in the US called the Women's Alliance for Medical Marijuana. And many of the people that I was doing research with, the research participants, they were comfortable using cannabis, but they all told me, I came into this, didn't know what to do. And I was sick with cancer or AIDS or MS or glaucoma or whatever it is. And so their social circles have shrunk. Their ability to work might have gone away, right?
Mhm.
They're in a difficult economic position. They're in a difficult social position, a difficult medical position, right? They need places where they can go and interact with other people who can share knowledge with them, who can support them, who can be a helpful hand in what is a very trying and difficult period for them. And if we don't appreciate those challenges and simply make policy that is designed to, provide the greatest public health protections, you might actually end up harming the individuals who need that guidance and support. Particularly, for example, in Canada, the retail non-medical stores, our bud tenders are prohibited from discussing any potential benefits about cannabis. So they can allude to things or say other customers may have experienced this,
Mhm.
or other customers tell us, but they
Mhm.
can't actually provide any information that would benefit or would encourage consumption of cannabis. And so people go in expecting, okay, I'm going to go in and get some information about cannabis, and what the bud tenders can say is actually very, very limited, and can be detrimental to the public health goals of wider
Mhm.
legalization.
And it's knowing where that kind of who is in the position to provide that kind of information, the kind of, to patients or consumers and things like that. And I think one of the things, just to kind of round things off, one of the things I love about the industry is that there's always a workaround. There's never, like you say, other people have experienced, there's always a way. That's the thing, and that's what kind of gives me hope around these different things. It's like, if the information's there, someone's going to get it and it's going to be disseminated. But it comes back, like you say, to that sense of community that, we're all fighting for a similar cause here, even if we've got kind of different objectives. And I think, again, if it's about giving, destigmatizing and giving people access to cannabis who want and need it, then, anything that allows that is worth considering. And I think that's something that more and more we have to look at here in the UK as a way of, not only kind of justifying why cannabis is or should be, recreationally legal, but also just to kind of, give people, a starting point, for those who were just intrigued by it. So,
Like I
it's
say, if the Germans are a step ahead of you on this, and they've got far fewer cannabis consumers, and are not not known for being at the forefront of
just, yeah,
drugs policy liberalization, I think the UK's got some catching up to do. But it
absolutely.
can be done well. It can be done in a way that meets with the public health needs of the UK. And listen, I had never experienced a socialized medical system. I grew up in the US, and when I came to the UK, I was blown away at the capacity and capabilities of the NHS. Limitations totally there,
Hmm.
I know, and
Hmm.
trust me, we've got those challenges in Canada too. But what it showed me, that there was a focus on individual well-being that was taken quite seriously, and there was also a focus on public well-being that was taken quite seriously. And I think that the public health well-being and the public health goals that the UK really does embrace quite strongly can be met under a regulated cannabis regime that can be implemented in the UK. The UK seems quite far away from it right now, but I have every confidence that as the stability and benefits are seen in Canada, the lack of significant harms from legalization are more and more apparent, that the UK will move in that direction. I know Keir Starmer's a former prosecutor. He might not be at the forefront of that push
Well,
for
I
legalization.
think was hearing this morning around the NHS needs to be completely transformed. So again, if thinking around these different ways forward and different perceptions of healthcare and what it means, and what people want, again, I think people are more mindful of what they're putting inside their bodies now more than ever. I think there's every chance that this sort of conversation around cannabis needs to sit at that table. So we fingers crossed. I think that it's going to be a while, but things are happening. So, but no, I think we probably just need to make you some sort of government advisor over here. So yeah, come back, Dr. Daniel.
I love coming back to the UK. I've only been able to go back a few times since I left, but every time I really cherish it. And I had a chance to travel around the UK. Lived there for 5 years, went on a lot of walks, and traveled all around the country. Met my wife there. I have a real fondness for the UK, and I really hope that there's progress towards a better cannabis scheme, because what I saw as a researcher there, what I've seen as a researcher here, leads me to see quite plainly that the policies in place right now simply aren't working, both for the individual and for the society at large. And so there's opportunities to do it well, and I look forward to coming back to the UK. And God, if I can help in any way shape those policies to be fair and effective and in the public health benefit, then by all means, please call me over. Always happy to.
There we go. Cool stuff. All right. Well, thank you very much, sir. Great to talk to you. And yeah, thanks again for coming on.
Cheers. Thanks so much.
All the best.